Welcome to the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable's latest event. It's the State of Play in Biotech, and most of you who've been here before know me. I'm B.J. Belloc. I'm on the management committee, and I run the monthly forum committee, which puts on these events. As you can see, we have an intimate audience tonight. I think one of the challenges lately has been post or semi-post COVID. Lots of folks are still a bit hesitant, and from what I've heard, there are a lot of folks out on the Jersey Shore and out in the Hamptons right now, and we're all stuck here.
We're not jealous.
No, we have the bar. So we're good. So anyway, before we get started, if everyone can just turn off their electronic devices so we don't get any ringing. We're actually videotaping. We do post these to our website. Ultimately, these cameras are supposed to live stream, so sometime in the near future we'll be live streaming. And with that, for our main event tonight, we have Marc Pentopoulos, and he's the founder and managing director of Vista Point Capital, where he's helped secure investment capital, licenses, and partnerships for small life sciences companies. I hope they're life size. Prior to founding Vista Point Capital, he was a partner at Symmetry Capital Management, and that was a life science fund focused on investing in smaller public healthcare companies, where he co-founded the firm's Parallax Biomedical Fund. Marc has more than 20 years of experience in investing in healthcare companies, as well as working with small life science companies. Got a problem with that one. To develop their products, create pharmaceutical development, and licensing partnerships, and finance their businesses. Tonight's moderator, which you probably know as well, Bob Stearns. He's a managing partner at Longship Alternative Asset Management, who himself has 30 years of experience in the hedge fund business and, of course, in the biotech life sciences as well. Bob's background includes trading, research, raising assets, and his big claim to fame is he was starting his career with Bruce Kovner, which I assume everybody knows, as his trading assistant. He's got some wild stories about that, but after the panel. Ask him if you're interested. And he, Caxton grew to one of the largest global macro funds, as we all know. So what we're going to do is I'm going to pass it to Bob. We'll have a nice little fireside chat here with Marc, and then Bob will pass it back to me. And before we break for networking and more cocktails, I'll give you a rundown on what's coming up. So without any further interruption, Bob, it's all yours.
I'm probably going to repeat a little bit of what BJ said. Welcome to the New York Alternative Investment Roundtable. It's a fireside chat event entitled Biotech and Healthcare. We do not have a fire. And if you do not like the chat, please do not light me on fire. Our guest this evening is Marc Pentopoulos, Chief Investment Officer and owner of Vista Point Capital. He manages the Parallax Biomedical Hedge Fund. And I first met Marc in 1999 in San Francisco, where we both worked at the same firm. Basically, for full disclosure, Longship raises assets for hedge funds, a few select hedge funds, including Vista Point. So we'll start off with Marc. Welcome, and tell us about yourself.
Great. Well, thank you. So I've been in the healthcare field my whole career, both on the investing side as well as on the development side. So working to develop new therapeutics, business development strategy, capital raising, things of that nature. I started my career on the investment banking team at Cowen, who's a big bank in the healthcare space. So I've kind of seen both sides of the business, both the investing side as well as the actual drug development side.
You met a lot of interesting people in San Francisco, and your family was connected to the biomedical field. Tell us about that.
Yeah, my family's definitely heavy in the healthcare field. One of my sisters is a doctor. My dad started some medical device companies. My mom's was a biology and chemistry teacher. My grandfather actually was the Minister of Health for Zimbabwe, so definitely have a lot of healthcare in my family. And the Bay Area was really kind of the genesis of the biotech industry. I mean, that's kind of the very first biotechs were founded, like Genentech. The universe has kind of shifted a bit to Boston now, so I'd say Boston's more of a biotech hub, but the Bay Area is certainly the second largest biotech hub after Boston. The Bay Area has been a very interesting place for novel development of new drugs, and certainly many of the big, well-known drugs that are on the market today were originally developed out of the big centers of big university centers in the Bay Area, mainly being UCSF, Stanford, and UC Berkeley.
Well, Mark, tell us about your fund.
Yeah, so I look for innovative, interesting companies that have interesting products and a model that can drive to profitability. Where we tend to be a bit counter-cyclical in our investing strategy, meaning that we tend to like to invest in the sector when things are rough, like they currently are in biotech. And we tend to be more conservative when we see a lot of frothiness. We also have an active short portfolio, so we are actively looking for companies that we think are overvalued or could go out of business. And we try to balance the two. And we always kind of have a bit of a value bias to what we do, but we are also looking for interesting growth companies. So I could say growth at a reasonable price, but that doesn't really apply to biotech because it's really a boom or bust sector. And when it's bust, there's just lots of value available, and when it's boom, there's very little that's still cheap.
Tell us about Theranos, and how weird was that? And start with what Theranos was.
So Theranos was a diagnostic company that claimed to be able to take a drop of blood and do all kinds of diagnostic tests on a single drop of blood, which turned out not to be true. It was very strange and odd, but all the warning signs were there and all the red flags were there. Including not willing to tell you how the technology works. Wearing black shirt, black turtlenecks. Talking about how they're the next like the ghost of Steve Jobs, or there was just a lot of smoke. And I think she really took advantage of a lot of people that didn't really understand the biotech sector, because she didn't have a lot of healthcare funds that were invested in it. Because, as a healthcare fund, if someone says, "Well, we're not going to tell you how the technology works," it's usually a sign to walk the other way. It was very odd and strange, but unfortunately, because the biotech sector is quite complicated to understand, you do get a lot of charlatans that come in and proclaim things that are just not true. And so it's a challenging space to invest in because there's a lot of moving pieces, and it's very hard to understand some of the science and whether the companies got it right or not. And so it's one of the other reasons why over my career I've kind of leaned towards the value bias in the investing, because I try to always quantify, if I am wrong here, what is my downside risk? And I think that's a very key thing to do when you're investing in the biotech space.
Okay, the elephant in the room. A few really large healthcare biotech funds got way too big, like $13, $15 billion. And they bought a lot of smaller stocks. And from the global macro side, where we were traders, not investors, it was referred to as the Roach Motel trade. You can get in, but you can't get out. And what we were told, because we used lots and lots of leverage, and we did not invest in companies, we basically went after indices. You want to short the Nikkei or the S&P or whatever. We used lots and lots of leverage, but we knew how to get out within 24 hours. And it appears that at least 3 of the funds and maybe 5 of the really big healthcare biotech funds are stuck in the Roche Martel trade. One of them is down over 70%, and a couple of others are close to that. Mark, many healthcares have suffered in the last 2 years. Several of the largest obviously have massive drawdowns. What do you think went wrong?
I think you had a classic bubble in the biotech space. You had a lot of liquidity. When there are 0 interest rates out there, you get more speculation, right? And biotech is kind of a sexy industry. It's there's a lot of things you can say about why biotech's a great place to invest. And I think a lot of capital just flooded into the sector. It's still flooding into the sector. I just saw a couple of venture funds just raised, I think, $1 billion each. So just a lot of money came into the sector, and as you said, these are many times publicly traded companies. But when you have 4 or 5 large funds that own the majority of these companies, and they're not very liquid, because we have seen liquidity dry up in the public markets. They're essentially venture funds at that point in time, and if those funds, want to sell, the stock price goes down dramatically. So I think what happened is you had a kind of a classic bubble. Everyone jumped in. A lot of money came into the space. You had both hedge funds, doing venture, so they would do these mezzanine rounds, or they would do venture rounds, hoping to get the companies public. Some got public, others didn't get public, but the ones that got public, they would kind of spike up after the IPO, but then, they're all down, well, not all, but many are down, 50 to 70% from the IPO price. And, that's what happens in bubbles. And, you also had some of these like funds like the ARC Genomic Fund, again, just, with money coming in, they're required to put that money to work. They buy the stock goes up. As the stock goes up, the value of the ETF goes up. As the value of the ETF goes up, people want to put money in to participate in that, and it just kind of drives itself up. And then on the other side, when it starts to go down, people want to pull their money out. They have to start selling shares, and it just kind of unwinds itself. And so I think you've seen kind of both things with the hedge funds that got way too exposed to healthcare, or were not hedge funds anymore. They were essentially venture funds at that point in time. And then you also had certain ETFs that kind of have ridden the wave and ridden it back down the other side. So we haven't seen I think mass scale liquidation in the sector. So you still look at many of these public companies, and they're still owned primarily by 4 or 5 of the top big healthcare funds, and I don't think we've seen lots of redemptions from those funds, and so we haven't seen a lot of liquidations yet. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
If you were a global macro discretionary trader, the first book your boss gave you, whether you were Paul Tudor Jones, Bruce Kufner, Louis Bacon, was Extraordinarily Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Best book on trading ever written in 1870. Doesn't even cover the 1929 crash. Now, we've all heard the story of tulip mania in Amsterdam in 1637, where 10 tulip bulbs were traded for a large townhouse mansion on the Grand Canal. The last number I came across was $28 million, is what it's worth now. You can now buy those 10 tulip bulbs for 59 cents each at Home Depot. That could never happen here, of course. Bitcoin, crypto. Anyway, part 2 of that was, in addition to the tulip mania, there was also in London something called the South Sea Bubble. And a Wikipedia article for the South Sea Company says that among the companies to go public in 1720 is famously one that advertised itself as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Mark, so what do you think about SPACs, special purpose acquisition companies? Are these great investments even if nobody is to know what it is?
Well, actually, I think Theranos would fit that description quite well, because again, they just wouldn't tell you how it worked, right? So with SPACs, you know, I mean, I've never liked SPACs. I remember talking to another hedge fund manager, and I thought his description of a SPAC was very good. He said it's like a hedge fund that invests in one company. And I thought, well, that's actually kind of that's kind of true, right? I mean, you raise a bunch of money and then you say, well, you know, we're going to buy this one company and we're going to charge all our fees for us buying this one company. You know, many times these SPACs are loaded up with all kinds of fees by the sponsor, so I've never really liked them very much. And, you know, I've always wondered, well, you know, if your company is so good, you know, why don't you just go do a regular IPO, right? Why do you need a SPAC, you know, to go public if your company is so good? So basically, you know, it's you know, people giving money to a group or a person to say, you know, you are very good at selecting the right company, and you know, I think that many times there's like the incentives are just not aligned, and so I've never invested in a SPAC. I've always found, more as a trader, you know, what I see with SPACs is, you know, they kind of take them up out of the gate and then they crash. So you can actually make money on the short side on SPACs when they just kind of take them out, and then the dust settles, and then I think you can kind of sometimes pick through some of these SPACs. But you know, many of these SPACs, you know, I don't know if they're going to stay in business, if these companies can stay in business, because they weren't companies that apparently couldn't go public by normal means. I think some of them, of course, will survive, but I think the SPAC mania was, you know, just, you know, a similar kind of mania like the big biotech mania. I mean, it's you know, there was so much froth a year and a half ago, and it was primarily, I think, driven by just so much liquidity being out there. Like, who wants to sit in cash at 0%, right? And so everyone was kind of speculating.
Mark, relative to the biotech sector, are there a lot of SPACs there?
Yeah, there were definitely some SPACs. A lot of the big biotech funds became sponsors of SPACs, so they were putting their own SPACs out, and so you did have a number of SPACs that were formed in the biotech space. You know, I don't know if it was high relative to tech or some other sectors, but there certainly were quite a few SPACs in the biotech space. And I think that the majority of them are deeply underwater at this point in time.
Mark, if some of the large biotech hedge funds have to liquidate, I mean, they're just forced at some point, you're down 70, 80%, and you know, the endowments and universities just said, we're done, and we're out. Does this eventually present an opportunity for smaller funds that did not get hurt that badly?
I think it probably presents both an opportunity and a risk, because you know, if they get out and you're in the stock, you're obviously going to get hurt with that position, and also if they get out, does that hurt those companies' ability to you know fund in the future? So I think you know, whenever there's turmoil, I do believe that usually there is good opportunity, but I think one has to be careful and really kind of know who your holder base is and know what the prospects are and how long that company can survive, and you know, can it get to profitability without having to access the capital markets again.
Mark, what's your overall idea or outlook on the biotech sector now?
Well, the froth is gone, that's for sure. So that's, I think, something that's more positive, right? Because I think there's some realization that's setting in. I don't think we're quite at the bottom yet in biotech, and the reason I say that is because, if you look at bubbles, they tend to unwind over a period that's longer than a year, and we're about a year and 3 months into the pop, right, which was February, March of last year. So I think there's probably some more tough times ahead for the sector. I think the sector has to consolidate. There was there's like 1,000 public biotechs out there now, and that's just symbolic of bubbles, right? So you get 300. You get I think there's probably about 300 public biotechs about 5-6 years ago, and it ramped up to 1,000 or so. And so you just have a lot of companies that are don't have the capital to get to the market, and we had 3x more biotechs, but we didn't have 3x more diseases, right? We didn't have 3x more people with diseases, right? So so it was just very symbolic of a bubble, and I think the sector has to consolidate. I think you're going to see some buyouts by the big pharma companies, although they're not going to just go buy everything. There's going to be kind of selective acquisitions. I think some biotechs will probably start to merge with each other. I think some biotechs will go out of business, and then some will be fine in the long run. If they finance themselves well and they haven't wasted a lot of money and they have a strategy to get to profitability. So, I think I think tough times remain, but I'm a little more bullish on the sector than I was, say, a year ago.
Mark, can you talk a little bit about innovations in the space, therapeutics, whatever? What are you particularly interested in right now, and maybe not to buy, but down the road?
Well, the stock prices are doing badly, but the amount of innovation in the space right now is phenomenal. I mean, we are able to cure genetic diseases now. We can prolong a patient with cancer much longer than before. We're doing things that we kind of only could dream of doing 10, 15 years ago, and the pace of innovation has actually really picked up a lot. So we really understand the biology of many of these diseases much better, and we know how to drug them in a way that produces good outcomes for the patient. So there's actually a lot of very interesting things, and I do think we are looking at a future where we can actually cure many diseases. We really are close to that with many diseases, and it's fascinating to think that we can actually change someone's genome so that they don't have that disease anymore. I mean, it's quite fascinating. So I am very optimistic about the innovation in the sector, and I do think that there are plenty of opportunities. We have to figure out the model for how do we commercialize those? How does the society afford those? Can we do those at a cheaper cost than we currently have? Because many of these very specific cell-based, gene-based treatments are $500,000, maybe even more. So pricing is a bit of an issue, but I certainly think that as we can figure out ways to do this more cheaply, we can drop the pricing. And listen, if you can cure somebody and give them a full life, that they don't have to take chronic therapies for their whole life, I think there's a lot of value to that. So I'm very optimistic about the technology and where we're going from a technological standpoint. I just think from the capital markets as well as the cost of healthcare and the cost of delivery of healthcare, I think that's where some challenges lie.
Why don't we open up to questions? Eddie, since you were quick.
So I guess I've got a question related to, related to bubbles and warm. I talk loud. My wife says.
Absolutely.
They all do.
Anyway, so basically, Warren Buffett said, right, like when the tide goes out, you find out who's wearing a bathing suit.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's one thing.
Yep.
When you recognize, not that you're in a bubble, but that you were in a bubble, and the bubble is gone now, there are going to be companies that fail. And some of those companies will be companies that should have failed, like maybe Theranos.
Yep.
But some of them will be good companies that just can't get enough capital.
Yes.
They're going to bleed to death or starve to death, whatever you want to call it. What do you invest in those, or do you let them just? You have to let them go, I guess, right?
You have to let them go. If the drug is, so you kind of have to do an analysis, right? Very specific analysis for that. So what is that drug? What's the competitive landscape like for that drug?
Right.
How many patients have that thing? What can they charge for it? And what does the intellectual property look like on that drug? If those things all look good, it probably gets acquired, right, by another company,
Okay.
right? So there probably are some specific opportunities to buy some of those companies. The problem that you've had in biotech with the space right now is that, back in the last bubble, no biotech ever raised debt. All of a sudden, this, royalty debt starts coming along and these debt instruments. And so you would have to be careful that the one that is a good board there that can, do the right thing by shareholders. But you have to be careful you don't get caught where it goes bankrupt and the debt holders basically take that drug.
Right.
But if there is a very low market cap and maybe there's not too much debt, there's maybe $100 million of debt or something at the company, but that product should be worth, say, $500 million in the right hands. You should see someone take that out. So I think it's on an individual basis. I think if you do not have a good board and you do not have a good management team, I think you can probably assume it will go to zero. So you want to avoid that. But there will be some opportunities. But again, you got to be careful about those opportunities and really kind of pick through them very carefully.
You have to know who. You have to be connected to that kind of capital, so that if they're willing to play ball, you can say, okay, I've got the guy with it that'll do the debt.
Yeah, you can. I mean, you could potentially restructure those companies, but I think in some of those cases you'll just have a larger company buy them.
Okay.
So if you would want to play that as an investment, you may have a small position, given that it's at a very, very low valuation with the anticipation that it will be bought at, and you could make some very conservative estimates as to what the value of that product would be.
Great. Thank you.
Yes.
Mark, so talking about Theranos.
Yeah.
I have read John Carrero's book and his coverage in the Wall Street Journal and watched some interviews. And he made the point that as soon as he heard about this company, he immediately became kind of curious, because we're talking about a field where there are people who have spent decades of their careers, not years, but decades, trying to understand these enormously complex medical and genetic and molecular and ethical and moral questions. And here you have this 19-year-old dropout with a couple of semesters of undergraduate coursework behind her, who says that she's going to change the world. And he immediately found that curious and suspicious, and that kind of set him on the trail to do some very hard-edged investigative reporting, which led to him bringing down the company. And I cannot fathom how, obviously very intelligent people who went to work for this company, they were not suspicious. And they allowed this deception and fraud to go on for so long and allow this thing to continue to grow, when I think any reasonable person would have had at least some questions about what was going on.
I think I think there was a lot of suspicion out there. Certainly, people I would speak to, they were very suspicious about this. So I don't know. sometimes like these like personalities draw people in. I think many times it's just this, personality type that can draws people in, and everyone gets excited about the vision of this. But the kind of hard-nosed scientists at some point go, okay, well, how does this really work? And I think that people, I'm sure a lot of top diagnostic people did turn it down because how does this work? Because there's a lot of what was claimed to be done is just hard to understand from a basic scientific principle. Like, how do you if you're detecting all these things in a drop of blood, you need enough concentration in that drop of blood to actually be able to detect it.
Yeah.
And so there's a limit to how much you can detect in blood, right? So unless there's a whole new field of science of these microparticles that we've never even heard of before, but then if no one's ever heard of them, how did this person figure it out without writing a paper about it, being published in a scientific journal? So, I think, I just think, these house of cards get built, and it's not just in healthcare; it's in other industries too. Until look at the financial industry, like the Bernie Madoff thing, right? How long did that prolong itself for, right? Some of the big, companies that were rolling up companies, or what was it, Enron? Some of these companies just, they're able to persist for a long period of time before they finally collapse. And I think people want to believe in these things. And if you have some very charismatic leaders of these companies, people get sucked in, and it's more true believers. Look at all these, look at a lot of these like cryptocurrencies now, right? You just get these cultish personalities out there, and people don't understand what they're getting themselves into. So I think that was the case with Theranos.
Mark, just to cut in for a second, was she claiming to do with a drop of blood what even a respected scientist would say you'd need gallons of blood?
Not gallons.
To take a look at this and figure it out.
No, but at least a vial. So yeah.
And were there any big, respectable bio investors in?
Not really.
There's your answer. Is
Yeah.
that no one that, other than the cold factor, no
Well,
one.
they got a they had a deal, I think, with Walgreens or one of the big pharmacy chains, but I think it was more of an exploratory type deal, and I think that as people realized that it wasn't really working as advertised, and I think that partnership fell apart. But yeah, I did not remember seeing large healthcare funds. I know Peter Thiel got involved, but he's more of a tech investor, right? And I think like Henry Kissinger was on the board, but okay, George, yeah, but what do these guys
know about biotech?
Yeah, exactly. What do these guys know about biotech, right?
It's a big name.
So always, when you see a board of directors with a lot of big name people that know nothing about the area, it's usually a sign. It's maybe worth stepping to the side on that.
I have a question about biotech as a sector. And you stated that you're a lot more optimistic right now. But could you give us a little better feedback in a sense as a sector? Where do you see it's heading? Whether you do see a certain potential growth in what terms for someone who is an investor? That's one question. Another question that I have is regarding the approval of new upcoming drugs. That there was a big discussion and a lot of articles that some of the drugs that are very positive and successful, they go through the approval procedure in Europe much faster and easier, where here it becomes almost impossible, and that there was supposed to be some sort of a improvement in that process. So those are the two parts. I'm sorry, but first it's really as a sector. Where do you see it's heading?
Okay, so first being where's the sector heading, and second being the describe the approval process in
Right.
Europe versus the U.S. Okay, as a sector, there are headwinds right now, right? Which is capital markets are drying up. These are, biotech companies. Most biotech companies need capital, right?
Right.
I mean, if there's one thing that biotech companies can produce more than drugs, it's shares of new shares in their company, right? I mean, so they need the capital, and capital markets are drying up. There has been a slowdown at the FDA, absolutely. I'd say ever since Scott Gottlieb left, it's been slow. There's been delays. There's been all kinds of issues with the FDA. So, there's a new director there now. I mean, hopefully things start to get back to normal, but there have been significant delays. And, for a biotech company, that's a real problem, right? Because
It's financial
it's
hardship.
very much, if you think your drug's going to get approved and you've built your commercial infrastructure out to launch that drug, and you get a 6-month delay, you've got people sitting around for 6 months waiting for the approval. So it's very hard for small biotechs, and I think the FDA realizes that's an issue, but we haven't seen any real improvements yet with the FDA. In terms of again, I think there's a couple things that would make me more excited. What I say right now is there's some opportunity in biotech, but you have to really pick very carefully. There's a couple opportunities here and there. I don't think it's broad based. I think for biotech to kind of turn around, I think one, you'd have to get some improvement out of the FDA. Two, I think you need to see some consolidation in the biotech sector. There's just too many companies that need to consolidate down. And three, biotech does not do well in a rising interest rate inflationary environment, right? Because you have the costs of developing drugs going up. You have no revenue to offset the rising costs. And, as interest rates go up, the weighted average cost of capital goes up. So from a valuation standpoint, as interest rates go up, biotechs look, less attractive. Biotechs are, a bet on the future, right? So as the interest rate goes up, the present value of that goes down, right? And then if we have continued inflation, it's going to be painful for a lot of biotechs because the cost of developing drugs will go up. So so right now there's many headwinds, which is why I would say I'm not super optimistic about the sector, but I think that to be constructive, I think there are some limited opportunities here and there. We are coming out of a bubble, and if you looked at the last kind of two healthcare bubbles, being the 2000 bubble in biotech and the 91 bubble, although I wasn't working at the time, but the 91 bubble was another bubble in biotech. Those bubbles took about 3 years to unwind. So, we're 15 months into this one. So, if we use those two as models, we would still have another, year and a half or so. We'll see if those are good precedents, for this one. But that's what I would say about the whole sector. With regards to are things getting through the EMA much faster than the FDA? I think there's, as I said, the FDA is just a bit of a mess right now. So I think things are maybe getting through the EMA faster. Historically, that was never the case, right? It's not like the Europeans can just, push drugs through no problem faster. I mean, they want to see the data. They want to know it's safe as well. And the models are a little bit different in that, even if the EMA gets it approved very quickly, it doesn't mean it gets launched in Europe very quickly, because certain countries will reimburse right away. Others, you have to go through the technology assessment process at the EMA before reimbursement sets in, and sometimes that process can take a full year after approval. So there's just different models, but I can't say that the EMA is much faster than the FDA right now, but certainly the FDA could be, if they got things more streamlined at the FDA, I think it would benefit the sector a lot.
Thank you.
Question. So it seems like the concept of pre-approval biotechs accessing the public markets is a relatively recent phenomenon, right? And you've had some success stories, as well as some undeserving companies raise capital, as well as acquisitions seem to move earlier and earlier in the stage of development. Now that liquidity is coming out of the system, now that rates are rising, do you think they'll be seen as just a one-time fluke? Will earlier stage biotech companies still be able to go public, or are kind of investors just going to be a little more selective and kind of leave it to specialists in that field?
I would say most biotech companies, very few biotech companies ever went public, even all the way back to the 90s of the early biotechs that already had, commercial products on the market and were, making a profit and things like that. So there's very few biotechs that go public that are profitable on day one. So if this was an abnormal phenomenon, it's been a 25, 30-year abnormal phenomenon. So not to say that, could we go back to, a time when, if you were not profitable, you could not go public? It's possible, right? It's possible. I think that's before my time. I don't remember those days, but I'm sure there were days in the early, prior to the 80s, right, where it would be hard for a non-profitable company to go public. So I certainly think that, biotech's going to be on ice for a little bit, and just because of the factors I just discussed. Will it come back? I would assume so, but I guess time will tell. I mean, a lot of macro factors affect this too, right? So if we have continued inflation and interest rates go up significantly from here, even then, of course, it's going to put it's going to put a damper on investments in biotech. I do believe a lot of, the speculation in biotech was driven by very low interest rates, right? If someone can't get a 5% return on a safe investment, they're only getting a 1% return on it, then they're more likely to speculate. If all of a sudden that person's getting 10% return, then they may decide they don't want to buy biotech. They'd rather just get the 10%. So time will tell.
Mark, can you talk a little bit about biotech in places like China and India relative to the U.S.?
Sure. So there's a lot of innovation going on in China. In fact, you're seeing a lot of Chinese companies basically come up with drugs. They just they figure out what the science is, and then boom, they come up with a drug. And the issue is that they don't have access to developing it in the U.S. So they'll try to develop it in China, or they'll try to get a U.S. partnership. So, there's certainly a lot of there's certainly a lot of technical competence that China has built in terms of actually developing drugs. I don't know how much of that would hold up against an IP challenge, or if they are, taking IP that and just kind of doing modification to it that would lead to problems down the road if it ever went to court. The whole environment for approval of drugs and commercializing drugs in China is very, very different than here in the U.S. But the Chinese government definitely try to harmonize their approval process to kind of align more closely with the U.S. approval process and European approval process. So I think there's opportunity there, but it's not I've just never really gone there to look for investments, and I think it's a market that if you don't really understand it well and you have really deep context there, then I think it can be a bit of a minefield. So I've just not looked around there. I've really traditionally stuck with U.S. and European companies. And
what about India?
I think India, they've always been they're pretty good on the production side. So that's why many of these generic drug companies are coming out of India. I haven't seen so much in terms of really innovation, in terms of innovative new drugs. I'm sure there are some, but I haven't come across that many of them. I think you're more likely to see innovative drugs, say, come out of Japan or Korea, where there's stronger intellectual property laws and also a history of deep academic collaboration with the U.S.
So during when COVID started, the coronavirus, obviously everybody was racing to get the vaccine. You're there, you're seeing companies, they've got it, this one's got prices up, prices down. So how did you use, with your experience, how could you separate the possibilities of reality versus the fakes or the charlatans?
I don't think there were too many. I don't think there were too many fake vaccines created. I think if you look at, the vaccines that were developed, even the ones that are, kind of trying to come to market now, like the Novavax vaccine, I think these are legitimate vaccines. Lots of companies, who had some sort of antiviral or anti-inflammatory properties, all of a sudden rush to go get funding and say, oh, we're going to run a COVID study. And, I say in general, if you were an antiviral company and you had interesting antivirals that had a mechanism that was similar to the mechanism that the coronavirus was using to replicate it, you could shut down replication, I think, that would be an obvious step that way. But I kind of viewed the companies that would kind of just jump in with their drug for whatever it was. For me, it was kind of like a red flag that you were just, chasing this because it was hot and you were distracted from your core mission of what you were developing before. So I can't tell you I was, active, really picking around trying to decide who the charlatans were or not, but I had a view that if you had an anti-inflammatory, drug that worked great in the lungs, that would make sense. If you had an antiviral, that would make sense. But if you were developing your cancer drug and all of a sudden you think, oh, well, maybe my cancer drug works in COVID, then we'll see. Yeah.
Where do you see some of the newer things like cannabis and psychedelics in the 3 to 5 year time frame?
Well, I don't know about like cannabis. You're talking about THC, in
just the whole plant, maybe.
Well, CBD is approved, right, for epilepsy, right? So we have CBD products now that have anti-inflammatory properties and they're approved. I have, in terms of THC being developed as a drug, I'm not sure I know of any real programs that I think are legitimate. I think with psychedelics, it seems to be a benefit in the major depressive disorder, treatment-resistant depression. There is kind of a model developing for these products. J&J got esketamine approved, which is a ketamine product for depression. You go in, you get you do an intranasal spray, and you get treated, and you kind of come back on an infrequent basis. The leading company right now is called Compass Pathways. They had a phase 2 study readout recently that showed good promise, at least at week 8, in terms of a reduction of depression. So I think there's a path there. We'll have to wait and see where the FDA comes out on it, but certainly it certainly seems to work. Psychedelics seem to work for certain people, and so I do believe that ultimately the FDA will let something like that through. I just don't know what the timeline for it is. In terms of 3 to 5 years, if they just finished phase 2, they have to run a phase 3 study still. So, I think the earliest you could see something like that on the market would be in the 3 to 5 year time horizon, and we'll just have to see where the FDA comes out.